Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Hannibal Season 1, Episode 4, Soof. Our episode in a nutshell is just a short summary of 1 to 2 lines letting you know exactly what's happening within the episode. A woman kidnaps kids before making them kill their families, while Hannibal takes more interest in helping Abigail. Now we'll go through our episode scene by scene and give our opinions on each scene as we summarize it in detail. Hannibal and Will sit across from each other in Hannibal's office for a session. Will talks about how he'll sometimes leave the lights on in his house and walk in the fields with his dogs before looking back and seeing his house all lit up, and he says that it feels like he's looking at a boat on the sea, and now that makes him feel safe. Hannibal then brings up revisiting Garrett's home, and Will talks to Hannibal while intermittently flashing back to entering the house, gun drawn. Then Will says that he tried so hard to know and see Hobbs, flashing back to announcing himself and shooting, then trying to put pressure for Abigail, then to Hobbs saying see while he dies. Hannibal then brings up Marissa, and the imagery again is shown on screen of Marissa mounted up on the antlers. Will says that it feels like he killed her due to how close he got, flashing back to lifting up her head to look at her face. Then Hannibal asks if it felt like he was becoming Garrett Jacob Hobbs. And Will then flashes to the dream he had of slitting Abigail's throat while the feathered stag watched, but he says he knows who he is and he isn't Garrett Jacob Hobbs. Now in this scene, we're basically getting a recap of the last 3 episodes, the Hobbs case so far, and Will's thoughts on that case. However, every episode of Hannibal starts with a segment for previously on Hannibal, happens. So we already get a summary at the start of every episode. So this part just kind of feels like a reiteration of what we just watched in the previously on segment. I'm not really sure that it really needed to be there. The only new information that we're really getting in this scene is the whole imagery of the lights on in his house while he's out at a field, looking back at it, imagining that it's a ship on the ocean. And of course, the imagery of the various crimes that have occurred so far, except the mushroom one, which seems to have been forgotten, which I feel is personally unfortunate. But apart from that imagery, those moments of the imagery that's showing up on screen, and even then, most of the imagery is repeated with Hobbs dying saying see, with Marissa being mounted on the stag's antlers. The only real new imagery that we get, again, is Will looking back at his house as it's lit up across a dark field at night. And it is a great image, but it's an entire scene, and that's the only new thing that we got. So I feel to a certain extent that the scene was kind of redundant and didn't necessarily need to be included, other than to pad the runtime of the show. This scene, again, opens on a very good imagery moment. We show a table of rotten food, bugs crawling in it, flies swarming around it, and then we see blood-spattered pictures on the walls, before it then shows 4 members of a family shot in the head at the table with their heads on their dinner plates. The pendulum swings, time moves back, and Will is sitting at the head of the table, saying that the table has been set for a family dinner. He wasn't invited. So, he takes the seat at the head of the table as the guest of honor. He then mimics a mother saying that if they don't eat dinner, they don't get dessert, before stating that nobody leaves the table. He then also notes that because they are too afraid and he brought his own family to the table, controlling them with threats of violence, that they follow through with eating the meal, even the younger children behave. While what he describes is occurring on screen, we then see that the family is shot. And he continues to clarify that the family is executed together except for the mother, who dies last, and this is by his design, and that he kills her himself. Will then comes out of his mind to tell Jack that the murders are about family values, and Jack asks, whose family values? Now, while this scene does have some creative imagery with rotting food, it's also disgusting imagery. So it's not really imagery that I'm as fond of as some of the other imagery that we encounter in the show. So while it does have the imagery, I am counting that kind of as a negative in this case, just because insects, it had worms, it had flies, it was disgusting. I almost wanted to throw up looking at it. Meanwhile, while Will is away at the crime scene, Hannibal's car pulls up to his house, and Hannibal gets out with a brown paper bag before letting himself in. He then pulls out links of sausage from the bag and he feeds the dogs pieces of the sausage before heading to the piano and playing a few notes and then snooping through Will's drawers. He then alters one of Will's fly fishing lures, purposefully pricking himself on the hook, all in complete silence. And thanks to the meat, even the dogs are silent in this scene. So because it's entirely silent, at no point in this scene do we get any explanation for why Hannibal is at Will's house. Will just lets himself in, and it doesn't, to my recollection at least, and I just watched it, but to my recollection, it doesn't look like he's using a key, so it looks like Will just left his door open, I guess relying on his dogs to be guard dogs. Or I might have missed that he did have a key and opened it. But again, it gives no explanation for why he's there. So is he trespassing? Does Will know that he's there? He obviously brought some sausage for the dogs, and again, I wonder what was in that sausage, if it's pork or long pig. But he's obviously gaining the trust of the dogs. They're not barking at him. They're happy to see him. He's brought them food and treats. And then when he is altering the fly lure, it looks like he put something in it before wrapping the string around it, which could be him planting evidence in order to begin framing Will. But it's a very interesting scene, and the fact that it's entirely silent leaves a lot of questions that aren't yet answered. Back at the crime scene, we learn a bit more about the family from Jack. We learn that the parents were childhood sweethearts with a successful business. They were pillars of the community, and they had 3 children. The son had gone missing the year before and was last seen boarding an RV and is possibly considered to be a runaway, but it's a probable abduction. And Will says that it could be both. And Jack concludes that when misery reigns, it pours. Will comments that the portraits show a false happiness, and Jack redirects to forced entry. Beverly, who is now processing the scene alongside Jimmy and Brian, says that there was no forced entry, and Jack concludes then that the door was opened to let whoever killed them in. Then they are ordered to collect the slugs for ballistics, and Brian gives his report on the trajectory and state of the wounds, saying that the shot went low to high, so the killer probably crouched. Will asks again when Jesse, the child, was abducted, and Jack reiterates that it was a little over a year previous. This scene, for the most part, is basically an info dump to let us know what is happening in this case so far. So they're basically just going over what who the family is, and what evidence they have to date. There hasn't been any insights, there isn't any real progress on it, just, like I said, an info dump update. We now move away from the episode's current crime scene to Abigail, who is in her hospital room looking at the scar on her neck before putting on a scarf to cover it. Abigail and Alana are then seen walking through the yard of the facility, talking about how Abigail feels that she can hide what happened as long as she has a scarf, with Alana pointing out that she's not supposed to be hiding, but working through her issues and through what happened, hence why she is still at the facility. Abigail then starts complaining about the other women in her group sessions and how they don't really understand what she went through. They went through other traumas. And Alana defends those other women while also pointing out that Abigail is of a higher profile, as what happened to her was all over the news. Abigail then says that she wants to go home, but then says that she doesn't have one anymore. And Alana offers to help her find a home, but not yet, asking her to give group therapy another try. But Abigail says that the group is draining the life from her. But unfortunately for her, Alana isn't sympathetic, saying that isolation won't help her much and she needs to find someone to relate to about the experience. In this argument, I'm actually surprisingly on Abigail's side. Group therapies wouldn't necessarily be helpful for everyone. Some people would gain benefit from sharing with a group, especially if others in the group had similar traumas to their own. But in Abigail's case, she is right. Like, what happened to her isn't necessarily normal that someone else would be able to relate to it at a random group therapy. There's also the fact that there are some people who are extroverted, need to share, need to have that social interaction and that friendliness. There are also a lot of us who are introverts, who are rather content and fine alone and working through our issues ourselves, and maybe one other trusted person, but maybe would not benefit from a group because you simply would not do well in a group situation and you don't like groups to begin with. So if Abigail is saying that group isn't working for her, I think maybe Alana would have been better served to try to find alternatives to a group therapy, maybe more one-on-one sessions, increasing those, maybe increasing one-on-one sessions with maybe a variety of people so she can get multiple perspectives, but rather than a group setting, especially if Abigail is indicating that it's not working for her and she doesn't like it. There's also, again, the fact that her issue is kind of unique, so the amount that of support she's going to get from a group is more limited, especially since in the scene and Abigail's complaints, it's kind of implied that some of the traumas the other women have are more romantically related than my dad was a serial killer and killed people who looked like me related, if that makes sense. So, surprisingly, in this one, I am on Abigail's side in this argument. Hannibal makes notes in his office when there is a knock on the door, and when he opens it, Alana is at the door, and he jokes asking if she has an appointment. Alana laughs and then asks if he has a beer. Hannibal then surmises that she's there about Abigail, as he hands Alana her beer in a fancy glass while he's having wine himself. And Alana then asks about the conversation they had, saying that it's hard to watch a young girl go so adrift. Hannibal suggests graduating Abigail from clinical treatment and letting her back into the world, which Alana protests as she has nowhere to live. But Hannibal clarifies that he doesn't mean abandon her. But Alana once again protests, stating that Abigail needs to figure things out in a safe clinical environment, warning against Hannibal stepping in as a surrogate, claiming that it would be a crutch for her. And by surrogate, of course, she means surrogate parent. Hannibal decides to defer to the passion of his colleague, and they clink glasses before seemingly moving on to other conversations off screen. The purpose of the scene, I feel, is to help the audience kind of gauge where Alana is with Abigail, like what she's thinking about her treatment of Abigail and where she's in the process. But why are you going to a colleague for advice, telling them about this issue, seemingly to get their input, and then as soon as they give the input, jumping down their throat and defending your side as passionately as she is, when you would assume the reason that you told them in the first place was so that they could provide an alternative opinion. And she just seems to kind of jump down his throat immediately as soon as he doesn't agree with her. And it's like, if you just wanted an echo chamber to say what you wanted to hear, maybe you shouldn't have gone back to your colleague, but to someone like a family member or something who doesn't necessarily have the professional capacity, would have been, yes, yes, I agree, you must be right. You know? So we're back in the labs, or well, not back in, we're in the labs for the first time in this episode, with all of the bodies on stretchers covered in sheets. And Beverly, Brian, and Jimmy start talking about their families. Brian mentions about fighting with his sisters. Beverly then says that she liked having a big family, while we learn that Jimmy has a twin. Brian then comments that Will must be an only child because family friction is a catalyst for personality development, and he doesn't think Will has one. Beverly notes that she was the oldest and the friction rolled downhill, prompting a conversation about where the best place to be born is, whether it's the first child, the middle child, or the last child. Jack then notes that except for the mom, all of the victims had defensive wounds, and Will says that it indicates forgiveness from the mother. This, of course, confuses Jack, who asks who would forgive their killer, and as Will looks at a picture of Mrs. Turner, who was the mother in the most recent case, replies that a mother would. This scene, if they didn't have the dialogue, would have been pretty boring, them all just standing around a bunch of covered bodies with sheets. So the dialogue about the families ties into the family values, ties into the case, and then it also serves to develop the supporting characters a bit more. We learn more about their families, their situations, and home life. We then get another session with Hannibal and Will, and Hannibal asks Will about his mother, continuing the theme of family throughout this episode. Will calls him lazy, telling him he's going for low-hanging fruit, but Hannibal counters that the fruit is on a high branch, and it's very difficult to reach. Will banters back that his mom is too high, as he's never known her, and then Will counters him and asks him to tell him about his mother. Hannibal reveals that both of his parents died when he was young, and that he was an orphan until his uncle adopted him at 16. Will then comments that Hannibal has being an orphan in common with Abigail, and Hannibal confirms that they both have much in common with Abigail. Will then goes on to say that he finds the concept of family an ill-fitting suit, but Hannibal points out that he's created a family. This, of course, makes Will scoff, saying he's made a family of strays, thanking Hannibal for feeding the dogs while he was away. But then Hannibal says that he had actually meant Abigail, not his dogs, before asking about the Turner family and the current case. And Will says that they lived like they had money, to which Hannibal replies asking if Will's family had money, bringing the conversation back to him, even though he was the one who changed the topic to begin with. Will says that he and his father were poor, and they migrated from boatyard to boatyard. And Hannibal translates this into always the new kid, always a stranger, and then asks what Mrs. Turner's killer had against her. And Will says what the killer had against her was motherhood, which Hannibal corrects not motherhood, but a perversion of it. So I'd like to start and call out, because we are talking about Hannibal's family a bit, that to view his whole origin story, Hannibal Rising is an amazing movie. I've watched it several times. I'll shout it out. It's great. And if you want to know like the full backstory, there's your perfect resource. So you don't even have to guess because we already know it and have seen his origin in the movie. And it's an incredible movie. I also like that this scene now has given us some clarity that that Hannibal did not, in fact, trespass at Will's house. He was there with the sausages on Will's orders, though I don't know if those sausages weren't pork, if Will would be as thankful to Hannibal as he is. Also, if he had known that Hannibal took it upon himself to play with his piano, go through his drawers, mess with his lures, if he would be as thankful. But he doesn't know these things, and ignorance, as they say, is bliss. And then I also love how Hannibal's talking about, him creating his own family, referencing Abigail, and Will's first thought and immediate instinct is, my dogs, right, I've made a family of dogs. And Hannibal's just like, no, I meant Abigail, who Will wasn't even considering, which honestly I find a little odd because of how focused they are on Will being on her side, Will being concerned for her, Will going to bat for her despite having very limited contact with her. But that also could be that very limited contact with her why his mind didn't really go to her first, but went to his dogs instead. Hannibal serves Jack dinner in his well-decorated dining room. As he's serving it, he tells him that it is a modified Boudin Noir from Ali Bab's Gastronomie Pratique, reminding Jack that he had promised last time to have his wife for dinner, but Jack quips about how they need to polish their act before they can have dinner with him. He then asks for the type of meat that he is being served, and Hannibal claims that it's rabbit. Jack says he should have hopped faster, and Hannibal agrees, thinking back to a man running in the woods. Before Hannibal, we see Hannibal tossing meat in a pan and then savoring a bite. Jack then brings up Will and how Will seems haunted, and children killing children shouldn't be foreign, suggesting it's connected to Abigail. And perhaps Abigail being implicated by Jack in her father's crimes. There's also the possibility of Will being wrong about Abigail, and Hannibal goes on to say that Will is in need of an anchor. And then it shows Will letting his dogs out and watching them frolic. Again, I kind of question in these scenes how ethical it is to be discussing Will. They're not going into specifics, but I don't know how far patient doctor confidentiality would stretch because they both know Will. If talking about him, even in a more vague capacity, at these dinners would be considered ethical. I'm on the fence there about whether I would think of it, because like if it was me who was Will, I would not want people talking about me behind my back, even if it's in vague terms. But whether that's unethical and breaking confidentiality, that's what I'm on the fence about. I also love that we have confirmation that it is not rabbit that poor Jack is eating. And we see who the victim is. They're not named or anything, but we do see that in fact there was somebody who was not hopping fast enough away from Hannibal before the meal. And again, they're doing it in a show don't tell sort of way. So they're not saying this guy's a cannibal, but they're saying he said it was rabbit. Hannibal now thinks about a guy running. We then see him cooking in a pan. We then see him savoring the meal. If you can put the pieces together, we now know Hannibal is a cannibal, and Jack, unfortunately, has unwittingly become one as well. So Beverly, Jimmy, and Brian are still working on the case in their labs as everything else is going on. And currently they are cataloging the evidence that they've found, including shoes, shoe prints, fingerprints, and narrowing it down to there being 3 boys there, which Brian quips are the Lost Boys. They also then extrapolate how tall Jesse might be after a year on the run, given his age, current place within puberty, etc., etc. And then Jimmy gets a hit on one of the fingerprints that he had taken. Obviously, this part is mostly just there to say, ooh, we found a clue, but we're not telling you about it. We're building tension, suspense. But also, it's to remind us that there actually is a case still happening in the background because we've had a lot of people having conversations in various sessions and meetings and such between when we first were introduced to the crime scene and now here. So I think that it's also there to remind us that actually in the background there is actually still a case going on. This isn't just a bunch of people talking to each other. Will is giving a lecture to his class about essay as it relates to crime scenes when Jack walks in, dismissing everyone and yelling again when the students hesitate to leave. Will then tells him that he's making it very difficult to provide an education, but Jack informs him that they found a print match to another missing kid, someone named Connor Frist, that had disappeared 10 months previously. Will then asks how many kids there are, and Jack confirms that there's 3 that they know of. Just like the Turner family, there's also 3 children within the Frist family, and he tells Will to get ready to go. Will then deduces that he is expected that Jack is expecting a crime scene when they arrive. Obviously, as I already commented before, this again just reminds us that there is another crime going on, and again reminds us that Will's actual official job is to be a lecturer and teacher at the FBI Academy. He isn't actually supposed to be in the field. He was brought into the field by Jack. But other than that, short scene to move the plot forward. Before we see any characters, we see the scene. We see that the Frist's home is decorated for Christmas. The music of carols is playing in the background throughout the home, and the family are all shot around the tree with wrapping paper that's been discarded as they've opened a bunch of presents. And then we see one body huddled in the fireplace, burned beyond recognition. SWAT team enters first, with Will and Jack and the other technicians, Beverly, Jimmy, and Brian, bringing up the rear. And as they follow SWAT in, they all cover their mouths and noses due to the smell of presumably rotting corpses. Now, obviously, this scene doesn't have quite the same imagery as some of the other scenes that we find throughout the series. But the body that's huddled in the fireplace, that causes a twinge. When you see that, your heart hurts a bit, you twinge. It doesn't elicit a huge emotional response, but it definitely starts to tickle the emotions a bit. And I believe that that is the purpose for why they showed it there. And also the size of the body is, of course, highlighting the tragedy of it all. In the labs, once again, all of the bodies are laid out on gurneys and covered by sheets. And Jack goes over how the others were killed before the mother died last, just like at the Turners, which was the first crime scene. Will then points out that something went wrong with this crime scene, and Beverly says that the mother got no presents, and Will tells them that the killer took her gifts, just like they took her motherhood. Brian then also points out that the first shot didn't kill the mother, and it would have been messy as she would have started seizing. She would have had a physical reaction because it would have caused damage non-fatally to the mother. The second shot, which was the kill shot, had came from a different gun, is also noted. And Jack then asks about the body in the fireplace, and Will suggests that it's Connor, as he was prepared to shoot his mom, but not to watch her suffer. Jack suggests that Connor panicked and ended up getting shot too, and Will confirms that whoever had shot Connor disowned him. Of course, it's implied and not necessarily said out loud, but essentially the reason that he was overkilled and put into the fire after the fact was what indicated the disownment. And the way that Will says disownment, he says it in a very disgusted tone, like the person who did it thinks he's less than garbage now. While in a diner, Ava and the boys that she's kidnapped all drink milkshakes. We see Jesse, CJ, and then the youngest one, who is named Christopher. The oldest one, CJ, tells Ava not to be sad about Connor. And she sighs about how she just couldn't make him understand that family wasn't always family because you didn't choose them. And that found family is who you choose. And that's what they are doing. They are making a family. Christopher asks what happened to her original family, while CJ jumps in and tells him that they, the boys, are Ava's family. Ava comforts Christopher that the family he thinks is family is just a stepping stone to real family. And then she notices that he doesn't look well and asks if he's fine. CJ butts in again, saying that Christopher is fine, and Ava scolds him. Then she tells Christopher that he should be excited to go home to say goodbye, as they're his family, and he can only have one family. Now, there are a couple of callouts with regards to this scene that I want to make. The first is the way that Ava is talking to the kids is very condescending to them. I think it's meant to be motherly, but it's that type of motherly where the mother thinks their kid is stupid because she's speaking. It's a tone, it's very recognizable, and it's definitely talking down to the children. Like she has to talk to them that way or else they won't be able to comprehend what she's saying. And then we get to CJ, and CJ, of course, is the oldest. He's much older than the other two boys. And I cannot decide for myself whether or not CJ is brainwashed by Ava, and that's why he's seemingly on her side, or if he's looking out for the other kids. For example, when Christopher is looking well, he's interrupting and saying he's fine, as if to try to draw her attention away from him, which would then be like he's looking out for him. But at the same time, he's jumping in and saying, we're her family, don't worry about your other family, kind of agreeing with her on those things. So I kind of get mixed messages on whether he's completely brainwashed or whether he's old enough to play along and is trying to look out for the younger kids who maybe aren't as capable of understanding what exactly Ava is doing. Beverly comes to find Will in his classroom, asking what he's looking at as he's sitting at his desk, kind of staring directly at his screen, completely unmoving. Once his attention is gotten, Will comments that both of the kids that they know of so far were small for their age. She asks him what that could mean, and Will suggests that potentially they were on medications, for example, to treat ADHD, as those types of medications can affect appetite and therefore slow growth. She then tells him that Jimmy has found a match to the bullets and that it matches another murder a year previous. And Will then asks if that was a missing child too. Now with Jack and everyone, Jack informs them that CJ Lincoln disappeared 6 months before his mother's murder. Will points out that he doesn't have the characteristics of a sadist or sociopath, with Jack confirming that there is no criminal history with CJ, but then Will points out that based on the firearm, he seems to be Peter Pan to the Lost Boys. But Jack again kind of plays devil's advocate and counters that it takes more sophisticated manipulation to convince people to kill their families, but concedes that him being older, he might have picked up a few things when he had ran away. Again, with this scene, much like on the mushroom episode, we're once again referencing some of my favorite things. Peter Pan was my favorite childhood movie, although I don't really like that they're comparing Peter Pan and the Lost Boys to potential child murderers, but you take what you can get. And again, we have Will coming out with the medical knowledge that we as an audience are not told how he possesses this. Like, how does he just off the top of his head go, small bodies must have this mental disorder? I'm sure there are many things, including just a natural genetic predisposition to slower growth, a late bloomer, for these children being smaller. There's absolutely no, like, again, it could be the plot cheat of he makes intuitive leaps because he's empathetic, but at the same time, like, this is medical knowledge on how the medications work, how they would affect the body, what kind of medications they may even potentially have been on. And Will is not the character who has a medical background. Maybe, like I said, if it was Hannibal giving these lines, Hannibal might know. He was a surgeon, so he was obviously trained as a medical doctor before he became a psychologist. But Will, his background is his dad did boats, repaired boats, and then he was a cop in homicide, but just a cop. And now he is a lecturer, an FBI special agent who consults on cases due to his empathy disorder. But in none of the background that we have been given on Will does it indicate that he has any sort of medical background. So on the mushroom episode, Amuse-Bouche, we do not learn how he knew about the specifics to immediately jump to they must be diabetics dying of diabetic ketoacidosis. And then we also on this one, again, we don't get any explanation on how he is so well versed in the side effects of an ADHD medication that he can presume that these boys would be ADHD medication users. I don't know where the medical knowledge is coming from, and it's not explained to us as an audience, which annoys me because I feel like a show should let their audience know some things. Like if it's a mystery, like this is a mystery to an extent, maybe keep us in the dark about the things pertaining to the mystery, but we should at least know about the characters, their backgrounds, where their knowledge is coming from, because this just creates a question that we probably, if I recall correctly, are never going to have answered in the show. And it's one that's now come up twice within the first few episodes. And that is a little bit annoying to me as a viewer that they're not telling me where his knowledge is coming from. We're now back with our criminals, and CJ is walking through a convenience store while watching Chris from behind a stack of bottles. Chris has an accident at the checkout, and Ava notices after she checks out and expresses her concern that he could be sick. She then embarrassedly, or tells the cashier while embarrassed, that he's never done this before. He's never had accidents like this. The cashier gives her a napkin dispenser and she grabs a bunch of them out of it. She offers to pay for the napkins, but the cashier says that she doesn't have to worry about it. And Ava then tries to comfort Chris by saying that these types of things can happen to little bladders and that even though she is embarrassed, he doesn't need to be embarrassed. Now in this scene, again, Ava is talking with that kind of condescending tone, but also we see that the nervousness and fear of Christopher and what he's going to be asked to do by Ava is very extreme, and I assume the reason that they are showing a physical response to that fear is to truly indicate to us just how much he may not actually want to, but feel that he has to, and how much discomfort that may have him in. With CJ, again, I'm not really sure why they make a point of us following him through and then watching from behind the bottles. He and Chris do make eye contact as he's having his eye accident, so maybe that's showing that they have some sort of connection or feeling between them, but like brotherly feeling between them. But again, it's not really explained there, and it's just a short little scene where we're seeing them in a convenience store, which does become important later as well, as we will see. We then once again take a break from the crime of the episode and have Will arriving at Hannibal's office for another session. Hannibal comments on the fact that he can see a gift poking out of Will's bag, and Will says that he had purchased it for Abigail, but that he's now second guessing whether or not he should give it to her because at the time he bought it, he was upset, and in fact, he still is a little bit upset. Hannibal asks what the gift is, and he tells him that it's fly making gear. Hannibal then compares teaching her to fish to Garrett Jacob Hobbs teaching her how to hunt, which Will says is why he thought better of it and hasn't actually given the gift to Abigail. Hannibal points out that it's paternal behavior, and Will suggests he's also paternal, but Hannibal says Alana advised against being too personal and taking too personal of an interest in Abigail before asking and taking an interest in why Will is so angry. Will says that he's angry because the lost boys can't be helped, as he can't give back what they so willingly gave away. Hannibal clarifies that he means their families, and then points out that Abigail is lost too, and maybe they together are responsible to help her find her way. Honestly, I feel like in this scene, Hannibal is really pushing the whole family dynamic between him, Will, and Abigail. You know, he keeps trying to reference that Will is creating a surrogate family with Abigail, that he's taking on a parental role, becoming more of becoming a surrogate father to her, etc. And then also saying that he also, because he saved her life and is involved, that he also has become somewhat of a surrogate to her as well, and that they should take this responsibility on together and help each other out with it. And that also kind of points to where Hannibal's obsession of sorts that we know is coming with Will kind of starts being hinted at as well, that he wants to create a family with Will, that he wants to have Will be a part of it, and he's kind of using Abigail as the means to achieve that, in a sense. And now we have Hannibal visiting Abigail, who tells him that after she climbed the fence, she isn't supposed to leave the facility. But he tells her that he has made arrangements for them so they will be able to leave today. She asks where they're going to go, and he tells her that he's going to cook for her at home and then bring her back to the facility. She then asks if she can stay over due to her getting nightmares when she sleeps in the facility, but he says that she has to be brought back and then asks her about her dreams. Abigail shares that in one of her dreams, Marissa sends her picture text of a gutted Nicholas Boyle, and then confides that even though she's dead, she fears Marissa telling on her for killing Nicholas, and that they'll compare her to her dad, saying she can't talk about it in group because obviously nobody knows that she's the one who's killed Nicholas or that he's even dead. Hannibal agrees with her that it's something that she can't talk about, and Abigail supposes that she'll need to get used to lying. Hannibal says that she has to lie about one thing, but that he is somebody that she doesn't have to lie to about anything. She then adds that in her dream, she wonders how she can live with herself, but then when she wakes up, she knows that she can, asking if that makes her a sociopath. And he tells her that it actually makes her a survivor. They then get their coats and she leaves the hospital with him. This scene mostly is just kind of a little heart-to-heart between Abigail and Hannibal, reinforcing that they are sharing secrets that she's not able to share with anybody else in her therapy. And then Hannibal, who's made arrangements, though he is not her official doctor, so what arrangements he made is anybody's guess, then takes her from the facility and back to his house. Which I also find that a little bit questionable as well, that he's taking her specifically to his home, not out to a public place. But eh, I find it a little bit creepy that he's taking her to his house. But that's all I'm going to say on that. At Hannibal's house, in his kitchen, we show a pot of mushroom tea alongside other various ingredients while showing Hannibal preparing some food. Hannibal asks Abigail about her future plans, but she tells him that her dad killed at all the schools that she applied to, and then she shows an interest in being an FBI agent, but says that they probably wouldn't let her. What with and then Hannibal says that it's nature versus nurture, and she isn't her father's daughter anymore, before suggesting that they use the mushroom tea, as there are some psychiatrists who believe that it could be used in therapy, and he could help her create more positive associations so that she doesn't keep having the bad dreams that she's having. She questions him wanting her to do drugs, and he stresses that it is a specific drug while under his supervision as a trained professional. And then she asks if she trusts him, offering her the teacup that he's just poured tea into, and Abigail slowly drinks the tea. This, of course, is just showing us how manipulative Hannibal can be, and of course, testing her trust in him as well. But apart from that, we just get, again, a little more development in Abigail's character, trying to figure out what her future may end up being. But as I don't really like her as a character, I don't really care about her future plans or the things that they're talking about. So that's that scene. We're now back with our crime fighting team, and Jack is trying to create a geographical pattern, and Brian disagrees with the geographical pattern, but Will points out that there are other patterns involved as well. Like, for example, all of the children were middle children in traditional affluent families. Jack then tells them to look at every missing boy within this geographical range that he's created. Will says that the pattern is less geography and more psychology, but Jack protests what kind of kid would do these types of crimes. Will follows up with what kind of kid follows a kid who does these kind of crimes. Jack suggests that there's abuse involved, but Will then says that capture bonding, in order to bond with your captor, can mean the difference between surviving or not surviving. And this, of course, seems to lead him to kind of the beginnings of an epiphany, though we aren't really let in on what that epiphany may be. And we see how the team kind of feeds off each other when they are trying to solve the cases, each bantering about each bantering out their ideas, or throwing their ideas out there is maybe a better way to say it. With each of them throwing out their ideas, seeing what sticks, seeing what gets countered, what those counters may be, etc., etc. Back with Hannibal and Abigail. Hannibal continues cooking while Abigail flashes back to her dad teaching her how to hunt and butcher the deer, and then she drops the cup onto the ground, asking if Alana had said that this was okay. Hannibal cleans up the broken glass, confirming that Alana doesn't know, and while things are getting a little bit wobbly for Abigail, Abigail says that there's more secrets for them to share. He tells her that they're going to have many secrets, calling trauma an affliction of the powerless, and he intends to give her her power back, saying that he will be her guide while he holds her face. She then asks if they're having breakfast for dinner, and he confirms he's making high life eggs. She notes sausage and eggs was her last meal with her parents, and he notes that it'll be the first meal with him as well, and returns to cooking. Obviously, this goes back to where he had said that he had made arrangements with the hospital, and I had wondered what kind of arrangements he might have made, given that he wasn't actually her doctor, how far his influence or authority really would have stretched. And now we find out that in fact Alana didn't know, and so he probably just kidnapped her, took her from the hospital without her actual attending doctor's permission. But because he's Hannibal, he's probably going to get away with it. And now he has just drugged Abigail as well with the mushrooms in order to make her more susceptible to his various manipulations. Though he claims that they're for positive associations for her to have going forward. Alana, Will, and Beverly are looking over the various files of missing children, and she notes that without a leader, the kids would never consider killing. Will says that the boy will be an outsider that doesn't look like one and should have a vocation that's innovative or mechanical. Beverly then says that she found a boy who won an award for computer circuitry, while Alana asks what made the kids susceptible to CJ, saying they're brothers looking for a mother, which gives Will clarity, and the epiphany that started earlier is fully realized. Will then hurries off to Jack's office, where he tells him that it's not CJ they're looking for, but that there will be an adult woman as a mother figure looking to make a family. Jack notes that families can adopt similar behaviors and attitudes to each other, and Will tells him that the woman wants love from her family and needs to erase their previous families in order to get it. Jack then summarizes that she abducts, love bombs, then isolates. Will then mentions that Chris O'Halloran was on the store footage with an unidentified woman. Jack then asks where the parents are, and they find that it also fits the geological profile that they made as well. So this is where we find out all the pieces coming into place, why we had to have that brief little convenience store scene that didn't really seem to say or do much, and now we find out why. They were caught on footage, this footage is known, and now they have made this profile, the epiphany has been had, and they have who they're actually looking for, and have figured out that Chris O'Halloran is the next one who will be killing his family, so that they can arrive there and be prepared for that and hopefully save the O'Halloran family. We now have Christopher ringing the doorbell of his house, and his mother opens the door, is thrilled to see him, greets him with a hug, is overjoyed that he's come home. And then we see the FBI arriving, and SWAT breaks into the house, and they move through the house to the backyard where they find that the family is having a barbecue. And all of the family members are lined up with the children, pointing guns at the family. CJ is shot in the arm to prevent him from pulling the trigger, and then Christopher runs away while the FBI catches the other boys who are there. Will chases Chris through an opulent backyard into an area that's with a pool and a pool house. Will, who is chasing Chris, gets a gun pointed at him by Chris, and he raises his hands while telling him to put the gun down. Ava then slips out of the pool house where she was lurking and tells Chris to shoot Will. She puts her arms around Chris's shoulders, acting motherly, and continues to encourage him to shoot Will while Will kneels down and puts his gun on the ground. Then Beverly, who is over in the bushes, takes a shot at Ava, wounding her as the agents all arrive and swarm the pool house area. Will then approaches Ava, who is bleeding out. And While her death is not explicitly shown, it is implied that she eventually did bleed out. Have to comment on the fact that the backyard was a very nice backyard, had a whole deck area, then you went downstairs into where they had the barbecue area with a gazebo, and then, Chris is able to run even further back into this gigantic backyard to where there's a nice pool, a whole pool house. It's obvious that when they say like opulent families, affluent families, they meant it. And this house, the backyard, proves it. And I don't know why the child would be willing to give up that kind of house for a woman in an RV. But as Will pointed out before, that's, I guess, where the capture bonding comes into play. As we're beginning to wrap everything up, we have Christopher sitting in the back of a cruiser when Jack gets into the front. Chris asks if he's able to go home, but Jack says that it's going to be a long time before he gets to go home, because they know that he came to kill his family. Chris says that he wasn't actually going to do it, but Jack tells him that he needs to talk to people who are going to help him understand what he was going to do. Chris says that Ava told them they weren't his family and they needed to make their own family, asking if Jack has a family. Jack says that he has no kids, so Chris then tells him that he doesn't know or understand what it's like, and then he asks to speak with his real mom. But Jack tells him that he needs to speak to him first. This, of course, is a scene where we get to know a little bit more about Chris's thoughts on things. And then we also learn a bit more about Jack. We know already that he has a wife, but now we find out that he has no children, so he and his wife never had any children together, and therefore Chris doesn't think that he's able to understand him. And Chris in this scene, of course, he's not sad, he's not really showing much emotion, so it looks like he was successfully brainwashed. Hannibal's taking of Abigail out of the facility has been caught, and Alana has arrived and is yelling at Hannibal that as somebody who makes a very big deal about common courtesy, she's quite taken aback that he would take her patient out of the hospital without her permission. He apologizes to her, and she calls him shockingly rude. He admits to overstepping, and then Alana asks where Abigail is because she is not currently in the kitchen where they are having this argument. Hannibal tells her that she is in the dining room, but Hannibal adds, warning her that she was right about Abigail not being ready to leave the hospital. He then tells her, fabricates a story, that she had an anxiety attack, and so he had to give her a sedative. Alana asks what kind, and he tells her that he gave her half of, I can't remember what pill he said, but it was a half of a pill, telling her nothing to worry about essentially, but that Abigail may be a little bit hazy, and then follows her into the dining room where she's walking in to check on her patient. Alana then walks into a happy and dazed Abigail sitting at the table and asks if he was expecting her, as there happens to be a third place setting set up already for her. Hannibal pulls out her chair, and Abigail says that Hannibal made breakfast for dinner. Alana says that she could eat and accepts sitting there as Hannibal pours her some orange juice, and she and Abigail look at each other from across the table while Hannibal sits at the head of the table. Hannibal asks Abigail what she sees as Abigail's vision begins to blur, replacing them with her parents' images. She smiles and says that she sees family. Again, as always, I want to shout out the imagery in the scene. Obviously, Hannibal's dining room is an amazingly aesthetic set. It's incredible. It always is well decorated. Given the whole food theme that flows through the series, obviously they put special care into the dining room, and it shows. Abigail, while she's sitting there, both sounds and looks like a creepy person, like a creepy pod person. She has no emotion except like a vague happiness, and it is unsettling to see. And obviously, Given Hannibal's meticulous level of planning with his crimes, we can also assume that he did, in fact, always intend for Alana to find out, hence why there was that third place setting. He always expected that she would find out, that she would arrive, and that she would forgive him for it so he wouldn't be in trouble for what essentially was kidnapping Abigail from the hospital. And then, of course, for Abigail's side, it all morphs into family. And she's replacing Hannibal with her father and Alana with her mother. Unfortunately, Will is now cut out of the surrogate family. We now find Jack getting ready for bed while he sits at home reading, and his wife joins him. And then he asks her if it's too late for them to have kids. She turns away from him, saying that it is too late for her, and shuts the light off. He sighs, puts his book away, and also turns the light off. This scene is very short, but it could hint that there are some marital problems in their relationship, and that's maybe why he didn't bring her to Hannibal's dinner, as he had said that he would the dinner before the last one in this episode. But nothing is confirmed because it is so short. And then, to end off the episode, we get a short little snippet where Will struggles to fall asleep, surrounded on all sides by his dogs. So now we're to my favorite part of the video, where we are ranking this episode in the series. On the channel, we use two ranking lists. We have one that's more emotional, which is my personal ranking list, and then we have the mostly objective ranking list. What makes it objective is that it is absent of emotion, but because bias and judgment are still involved, that's where the mostly objective part comes in. So honestly, overall for this episode, there wasn't a lot to say, but the mostly objective rank values that apply, I have highlighted on the screen. And we'll start, of course, with the multi-season supporting character development, which is where we are learning about the families of Brian, Beverly, and Jimmy. And then we also have our multi-season main characters development, which is where we're learning about Will's family, Will being an only child, his mother having been somebody that left before he could know her, that he's never met, and Hannibal's parents being having died young, leaving him orphaned, and then him being adopted by his uncle. So basically, this episode really focused on family, family values, and developing those family connections. I almost added the strong plot concept because I do feel that this episode is memorable. However, when I was remembering this episode, I genuinely thought it was a Criminal Minds episode. I did not remember at all that it was a Hannibal episode. In my mind, when I thought of this episode, for whatever reason, and I don't know what it was, I thought it was a Criminal Minds episode. So while it is a strong plot concept that was memorable, it was also completely forgettable that it was related to Hannibal as a show. And for that reason, I decided that didn't apply. So in this episode, we get the development of the plot, not the plot development, but the family development, character development of three supporting characters. So that's 3 points each. And then, of course, we get the family development or the character development of the two main characters, Will and Hannibal, which is 4 points each. And this, of course, brings us all the way up to 17, which is well and away above our score of 10, which is the maximum score you can reach. Therefore, objectively, this episode is going to be a 10 out of 10 episode. And so, our season 1 ranking so far for our mostly objective ranking. In first place, we have Aperitif. Second, Souffle. Third, Amuse-bouche. Fourth, Potage. And then we're going to go over to my personal ranking for this next little segment that we have here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I found that it was a memorable episode, but I did not associate it to this show. And that means that it also was very unmemorable in that I literally remembered nothing outside of the part with like the woman and the kids. And even then I thought I was associating it to a Criminal Minds episode. I do like the character development, learning more about the families, but also, as I mentioned before, we already know about Hannibal's family. We have a movie, Hannibal Rising, that is incredible and gives his entire backstory. So we already know all this information. And if we don't, I would recommend watching that movie. We then also learn about Will's mother not being there and that his dad fixed boats. So we learn a bit more about their families, but that doesn't really impact the overall show. So it's interesting information that we're learning, but do we necessarily need that information or do we care about that information? Personally, I'm not sure if that's the case. Obviously, the parts, most of it was a little bit boring. It was a little bit of a slog to get through. There were a lot of parts that I did like, but also a lot that I didn't. And once again, I always have to mention that I'm kind of over Abigail. I don't like her as a character. I don't dislike her either. She's kind of a blah character for me. She falls flat. I don't really get any sort of attachment to her. I don't really get why she's a focus. So I'm kind of over her at this point. Kind of ready for her to make her exit scene, stage left, shall we say. So all of that being considered, oh, also, I did enjoy that they did reference Peter Pan because that is my favorite childhood movie, and I always love to see a reference that I can relate to. And so, all of that being said, I decided that this would get a score of 4 out of 10. I did like it a little bit more than I did Potage, which was even more Abigail heavy, but it still wasn't an amazing episode in my opinion. So, 4 out of 10 I think is fair, and that brings the personal ranking list to, in first place, amuse-bouche, second place, aperitif, in third we now have souffle, and in fourth place, potage. And our final segment of this video is of course our series ranking so far. This is where we're ranking each season against each other and adding the scores from each episode's rank out of 10 in order to determine with a percentage value how good this season is. So for this season, there's 13 episodes, which is a maximum score of 130. And with this episode, we've added 10 to that score, so that is now 36 out of 130. And then we have added 4 for the person. And with that, we've now rewatched and ranked Hannibal Season 1, Episode 4, Sooth. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next video.